on this computer. Yeah, right. Did it tell you it's recording? It said
Yeah.
that
Did.
it's okay.
Yeah, I always love the person just recording in
Recording.
progress.
It's like just
Thank
I
you, AI voice lady.
I find it interesting that Zoom couldn't like get someone to say recording in progress like a normal human. Like,
Yeah,
hey, that's fine.
ridiculous. Rachel, I need to ask this because I always want to ask this of English people or people from the Isles. Where's your accent from?
So
What?
I suppose probably from the south. I mostly grew up kind of London way,
Okay,
but
cool.
yeah, it's sort of Essex borders, but I don't sound very Essex.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
No.
But
I
I could if
I
I
can't
wanted,
really
but
tell the
I don't
differences.
really.
Yeah.
Everyone from the Essex borders can put on an Essex accent. This is true. This is a fact.
Yeah,
So
you have to lean into it sometimes. You're like, just look, I'm trying to get somewhere. Can you just get out of my fucking way?
yeah, see, you know what? Like that's the thing. Does it come out when you get like mad or something? Because for some of my friends who like if they get angry, they get more Essex. I would say
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, like actually, I think that's true of all my friends who have regional accents of any description. It's like it comes out if they're quite emotional,
Yeah, which
Mhm.
one
is
way or
great,
another. Yeah.
lean into that. I mean, because I live in Birmingham and Birmingham has the most hated accent in the UK, which I find really sad because I think a bit of Bromai is great, but
I think it's cute.
it's great. And my daughter had a really strong Brummie accent, but then
Oh.
after kind of lockdown, because she's basically just, trapped in a house with me, she
Mm.
kind of has worn off and she
Oh.
sounds a bit more just mainstream English. But I quite liked her little baby Brummie. It was good.
Um, my
That's
niece,
cute.
my niece, who lives up in Derby has such a cute accent, and I swear, like it is going to break my heart if she like grows out of it, which I'm sure she will. Like I'm sure the world is going to become horrible and like grind her down about it, but I just love it so much and it's just like so adorable. Like come on, children with a Derby accent, stop it.
It's
it is
good.
so cute. It is just
Yay.
adorable. But I like all the kind of regional things too. I like all the weird slang that you get, but I suppose that like when you are Americans, we're sort of allowed to appreciate British
Yeah.
regional accents, whereas British people will be like, no, no, unless it's a Yorkshire accent. Everybody loves a Yorkshire accent,
Everyone else
don't they?
wants it. My dad's from West Yorkshire, so I've grown
Mm.
up, knowing that that's God's own country.
Oh, there you
Who
go.
who who is famous with the Yorkshire accent so I can
Sean
place this?
Bean.
Sean Bean. Sean
Oh,
Bean.
yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Everybody
yeah,
does love that. Yeah.
yeah. See, it looks like, yeah, no, we do. Yeah.
I mean, I love it all. Like it's all delightful to me from the literal My Fair Lady Garn Cockney all the way up to like the British accent that scientists put on when they're doing like presentations, and it's like very pronounced and very stated, and we have to say these incredibly long words in this very serious yet slightly entertaining and whimsical to non-British people accent, and you're just like, yeah, man, you could tell me about black holes all day. Like there's this woman on YouTube, she works for NASA or something, but she has a British accent, and she's just like talking about this stuff, and I'm like, uh-huh, uh-huh, man, that's great. This is good. This is like this planet 9D47X, and I'm like, oh, that beautiful, such florid language they use. Like, yeah, man, you're a fucking yokel, dude.
I still run into people who get quite upset, Americans and stuff when they find out that I'm not actually English because they want the accent. And I'm like, yeah,
Oh.
sorry about it. And it's like, I take a big step down, but yeah.
The middle accent that you have between the two is fun though.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a nice midway point,
It's the
because
new
you say,
transatlantic, baby. You
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
know,
you could lean into that, go old school Hollywood transatlantic. There's
I
a
love
woman
that.
on TikTok who does that, and it's just, she talks about like modern dating stuff, but everything in that kind of golden age of Hollywood transatlantic accent is just great.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah, there's a now look here. We're here today to talk about like whatever. I love that. I love the transatlantic. Bring
Yeah.
it back. I say that's
Yeah.
see, look, that's something I'm returned with a V about.
See, that's nostalgia. We're
Yeah,
bringing it
yeah,
back.
bring it back. We must return to the fake accent that nobody uses.
Uh, and
Absolutely.
I love, And it's so weird because I love it, but like it's the evil guy accent because like every
Yeah.
bad guy in everything since since I can remember is like a British guy. Like it's like a stately British guy. Like all the bad guys in Star Wars, they're British. Old cartoons and stuff, it's always some like stodgy British asshole trying to do something. And at the same time, I'm just like, but yeah, it's a fun accent. I like it. I trust you to either do evil or tell me about a new planet that was discovered a week ago.
Yeah, I
Maybe,
mean,
you have there's a deep-seated longing there for like some colonial overlord kind of
oh.
action.
Hurtful. Hurtful. Perhaps.
Although,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
when I went back to the States, I was out having breakfast in Portland, and this woman from Texas was our waiter, and she was a delight. But she just wanted to talk about the royal family the whole time because she loved the royal family, and I was like, girl,
I
all right,
America,
you know?
my mom fucking loves the royal family, and I'm like, why? Like,
I don't.
it's not like a monarchy thing, but like, I think a lot of people here see it as like a pop cultural
Mm,
thing. Like,
mm,
it's not that they're a royal, it's that like they have all this pomp and circumstance and blah, and
mm,
like
mm,
I think
mm.
that's what my mom really likes about it. She likes the like pomp and the big ceremony and blah blah blah. But like, yeah, I've never understood like people here are just so into it. And like I know Princess Di is great. Please do not yell at me.
Yeah,
There's no
or die.
reason to yell. But like people who were like devastated by that, like my mom was, and like I remember when it happened and I was younger and I literally had to stop myself being like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like
Yeah.
I mean, like it's sad that a woman died, don't get me wrong, but you're not crying like every time like some random head of state dies in a car accident. Like, come on.
It's
Or is murdered in a car accident or whatever.
are you a truther, Luke? Are you
I
like one
don't
of
know.
these,
Wait. Is the truther thing that she was killed? I thought that
Oh
was the
God, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
There's
thought that was the like
like a
yeah, like she like the driver was
yeah, like the
whatever, but
the like
like
the Alphayads, like the dad, he's always like, oh yeah, Prince Andrew had them killed or something like that.
okay,
Am
so
I
I
right about
thought
that, Rachel? Am I making that up?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely some interesting conspiracy theory stuff there. I have a theory about like the public mourning, like for the Queen.
mhm,
I really think that everyone went crazy when the Queen died because we've had no public space for mourning after COVID, and people just
mm,
needed it. And a lot of people seem to think of her as like their grandma, or they could see
Oh God, yeah.
their mother in her, or something weird. So there's a lot of emotional displacement there, and it was just a space where people could pour out all these wounded feelings. And if, as a society, we had some healthy way of expressing our emotions, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But we're British, so yeah.
I guess that's really true. I genuinely hadn't thought of that, but I was just so flabbergasted by the whole thing that I just wasn't ready for it. I don't know. I just thought everyone was being camp about the Queen
Yeah.
before
I
she died, and I had to really reckon with the British public when that happened. I was like, ah, I see.
Yeah, another disturbing layer of our psyche revealed there.
It's like, 15 years later, it's 16 years later, you think that I would understand it, but no, no, it's
There's
still.
always another weird depth to plumb when it comes
Mm,
to being British. So
mm.
yeah, they just
yeah.
like yeah. To me it seemed like I don't know, like a lot of it seemed performative to me.
Oh, well,
Like
yeah,
people who were
yeah.
doing like who were out there doing that and it was like, okay, I have to do this because of whatever like reason, whether it's, deep-seated respect for the monarchy or whatever it is. But like a lot of it just seemed like people were like, "Oh, now it's my time to go out and just like, you know, fucking lose my mind in public. Like, oh, not dear old Queenie. Oh, yeah.
But I mean, like, yeah, it's I guess when Prince Philip was dying too, I was like riding my bike as is my wont, and I was one of the routes that I sort of take to go over to my boyfriend's house is like if I want to go for a longer ride, like I'll go and end up on like the Mall. And I hadn't reckoned with the fact that some people are bonkers. So I ended up on the mall, and there was like this big line of black cabs and people holding like Union Jacks and like someone with a bulldog who had like lined the mall. And I was like, oh, wow. Like for Prince Philip, which, and anyway, like I learned at that point, I was like, okay, well, stay alert like when the queen goes, like, don't, this is
Yeah.
not, this ride is off limits. So yeah, yeah. But well, anyway, speaking of whomst wants to talk about religion, religion, nostalgia, same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
definitely.
In a
All
lot
right.
of ways. Hey, you said it, not me. All right. Okay, well, I guess I don't have to count us down since we're all in the same source here. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just go into it here in three, two, one. Hello, and welcome back to We're Not So Different, a podcast about how we've always been idiots. My name is Luke Waters, and I'm an amateur historian. And as always, I'm joined by Dr. Eleanor Yanniga, who is anything but. Today, we have an interview, so there'll be no question for patrons, but yeah, we'll get back to it soon, we promise. But if you do want to join us on the Patreon, then please subscribe. It's just $5 a month at patreon.com/WNSD pod. You can get ad-free versions of all these episodes, get access to all of our bonus episodes, access to the Discord, and more,
Mm.
including we're going to soon have a vote to see what book our patrons would like us to do next for a book club series after we finish the thing with Andor, and we're going to have a vote between The Name of the Rose and the Decameron. So
Woo.
yeah, we will do you want to be fake modern Italian or fake medievalist modern Italian, or I guess actual medieval
What kind
Italian,
of, well, like,
whatever.
how do you want to talk about sex as a complex
Hmm.
sort of allegory or just directly? That's the question.
Pretty much,
That's the
yeah.
question.
Yeah, so if any of that sounds cool to you, please subscribe. It would help us out a lot and make us feel better. But yeah, anyway, on to the main show. So thus far in our series on proto-nationalism in the Middle Ages, we bounced around a bit and covered a few topics, including bad 19th century historiography about the medieval era, material factors that put up barriers to nationalism forming before the modern era, and the ever-present threat of Christian nationalism, both then and now. This week, we must confront an old nemesis, one we have yet to address head on in this series, despite it being one of the bigger factors in modern nationalism. I'm, of course, speaking about nostalgia and the idea of returning with a V. Now, nostalgia, broadly speaking, is not a bad thing. It's nice to watch an old movie and remember the magic you felt the first time you saw it. Fondly remembering good times with friends and family is a core part of what makes humanity, well, human. In its positive form, nostalgia can breed empathy and love and camaraderie and inclusion. And we need all of that we can get these days. But the problem with nostalgia is, simply put, the negative form of nostalgia is potent and as such is used to foster untold amounts of evil in the world. This negative form takes the good vibes and positive aspirations and corrupts them, twisting them into feelings of sadness and anger that the world isn't as simple as it used to be at some point in the imagined past. It says that all of the problems you see in the modern world, problems that are plainly obvious to even reactionaries, would just disappear in the blink of an eye if everything just went back to how it was. You know what I mean. But it goes even further, and you develop nostalgia, not for a moment you experienced in your own life, but for a time long ago before you were even born and things were better. Perhaps back in the medieval era when everyone looked like me and thought like me and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter that time only moves one way, or that things weren't actually really like that back then, whenever then might be, or that living in the Middle Ages sounds frankly horrific. And luckily, we've got a guest here to chat with us about the evils of modern reactionary nostalgia, Dr. Rachel Moss, who's a senior lecturer in history at the University of Northampton. Rachel is a medievalist specializing in late medieval English history and literature, as well as the social and economic histories of the Middle Ages, and is holding an upcoming workshop on politicizing nostalgia this summer. Rachel, how the hell are you?
I'm pretty good. Thank you for
Good.
inviting me along. Because this is a new area of research for me, but one that I feel is really pressing in the present kind of political moment, the cultural moment. And it's come out of working with my colleagues at Northampton, who are actually specialists in modern and contemporary fascist studies. And the Searchlight Archive, which we hold at the university, which is Searchlight is an anti-fascist magazine that was founded in the
Oh,
1960s.
okay.
Its
Yes.
ongoing mission, Star Trek style, is to basically combat fascism, and we're very lucky to hold all their historical archives. And working with these colleagues got me really thinking about medievalisms, the way the medieval is interpreted in the modern day, and how often the medieval crops up in contemporary fascist and extreme right spaces, because I can tell you it is a lot.
Mm.
Yes, it seems to be a cancer that is slowly eating away at people's minds,
Ugh.
unfortunately. Before we get into all that, I think the number one question on everyone's mind, Rachel, is what is one thing we should return with a V to? What should we go back to? What is one thing we should do?
Well, we should obviously never return to anything with a V. I was actually thinking, pretentiously about Ursula Le Guin,
Oh.
obviously big boss of feminist science fiction, and how she says you can go home again so long as you understand that home is a place where you have never been. And that really
Hmm.
captures something about, I think, this whole podcast. This idea of these places that we long for, they didn't exist.
Hmm.
And people's longing for them says much more about our present moment than about the past. So I think when we're thinking about all these things that people say they want to return to, what we need to ask is, what do these people feel like they're lacking in
Hmm.
the present moment? What is it they want to do to people? Who do they want to include? Who do they want to exclude?
I love
Hmm.
this lack. This is all very Lacanian, which I think that I charge the right in general with somehow being both like very Lacanian and Freudian, instead of moving into the smooth space of us over here on the left, who are all doing Deleuzian things. Obviously. Thank you. Shout out once again, stealing my boyfriend's research. Um, I will. I won't stop. I'll steal the research of anyone around me, and I'll say it on the podcast like I know what's going on. I don't care.
That's what being an academic is.
That
You just
is.
take
That's right.
research and
It's a
like
it's
I
a
mean,
citation if I say it.
like
That's
people
Say
just
it's
like,
practice.
you just copied what someone else said. Yeah,
yeah.
that's what we've all been doing. The
Uh-huh.
fuck? I didn't we didn't all independently go figure out how to split the atom now. Come on.
Yeah,
Like
like
what are
be
we doing here?
let's just be real. So
Yeah.
okay. All right. So I think so this is like a brilliant point that you've made, Rachel. But I guess so before we get into it then, I think we've got to be historians. And I think we have to ask how we're going to define nostalgia here for the person. Like, okay, so is this something that people actually remember, or is not remembering integral to nostalgia? And what do we mean when we say this, I guess?
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant question, because there's actually a lot of work being done by psychologists at the moment. So, like any good academic, I'm kind of going along and stealing their ideas. And there's been a lot that's being researched at the moment about how nostalgia is actually a really important emotional state. And actually,
Hmm.
nostalgia is a key part of the kind of the functioning of the human psyche. So on the one level, we could think about nostalgia defined most simply as a wistful or sentimental longing for a past period or set of conditions. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a past period or set of conditions that you personally have experienced, which I think is fascinating.
Hmm.
But when we look at the way nostalgia has been kind of used as a conceptual term for kind of an emotional state, it used to be considered a depressive illness or even a kind of neurological disorder. If you look at the way it was written about in the 19th century, people thought it was a sickness. But now the psychiatric communities think that it's an emotion that actually, a lot of the time, plays a significant role in healthy psychological functioning. Because I know today we're probably going to talk quite a lot about the really negative attributes of nostalgia, but that actually our capacity to be nostalgic is apparently something that's really important for our sense of ourselves. Like, so if you can think positive things about your past and imagine into your future, it kind of helps build a cohesive kind of sense of self. You have to be located in your own past to be able to imagine a future in some ways, because otherwise your personality and your psyche can be too destabilized. And as part of that, academics think that nostalgia actually plays a really important role in strengthening kind of communities as well. People sharing kind of nostalgic ideas of a past can bond them together. So there are all these kind of ways in which nostalgia is about a past that may or may not exist, but that an individual or a group of people share a concept of, and they have kind of warm feelings about. But we can see like quite clearly how that can very easily then tip into all kind of negative interpretations in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's like I suppose that's the thing too, is that when we do talk about nostalgia, you're right. There is this kind of tentative like negativity that we put over the whole thing. So I think, we'll say, oh, you're just being nostalgic about XYZ, if you get too wistful about something. But I suppose it is also how we kind of establish histories and connections with people as well. So like in your own family, it's like nostalgia's playing a big part in what keeps you kind of going as a unit, I suppose. But yeah, I do tend even myself to throw it around as a negative, which
and I think that's understandable, but I think it's also potentially made our understanding of nostalgia more limited. Like, for instance, the left wing, and I would definitely say I'm left wing, but we tend to think, well, we're not nostalgic about the past, we're better than well, it's right wing people who are really nostalgic, but left wing people are totally capable of being nostalgic. There are plenty of nostalgic references in kind of left wing movements, and I think sometimes the tendency to reduce nostalgia to a kind of a very crude sentimentalism means that people don't actually take the potential threat as well as the benefit of it seriously enough, because they just think it's people, sharing Facebook memes about the 1950s. That's just the surface layer of what we're talking about, right? That this is something that's bedded deep into people's brains, that we have a tendency to be nostalgic, and that in a lot of circumstances, being able to think positively about your own past helps you probably be a healthier person. It's just that there are lots of ways in which this can be weaponized, I think. So, maybe being a little bit more nuanced in our take on nostalgia will help us maybe be a bit more able to respond to threats from nostalgic political movements.
I suppose, if the biggest threat is all those people posting about, remember when you used to drink from the hose, that's like that's the low level threat. High level threat is people doing, I don't know, weird government coups and things of this nature. But yeah, a lot of that I'm quite fast. I love those Facebook groups. There's absolutely nothing to me funnier than a Facebook group called Who Remembers the Milkman or something like that. Absolutely love that stuff. Would love it more if you weren't going to see something racist immediately, but hey ho. So okay, so we establishing what nostalgia is. I think that you've already made reference to it, and it's just a fact of the matter that at this point nostalgia's been intersecting with medieval history in a lot of ways. And as medievalists, especially medievalists who are doing work in public like we are, this is something we confront all the time. And it's always someone who is extremely angry about something that they made up in their head that like they've never studied, They've never cracked a book about this, but they are so mad about, like, a new finding. This comes up a lot. So, I think the latest round of this has been people being really mad about that London museum study that dug up those plague pits and found out that there's like rather a lot of Black women in them, and that it seems like, probably enslaved African women were treated real badly in the 14th century. And like the reaction here is A, there were no Black people in 14th century London. B, if there were, everyone treated them really nicely. C, you shut up, right? And but okay, so we're seeing this a lot and it happens. Do you think that there's something about the Middle Ages in particular that makes it as an area of study more vulnerable to these impulses?
Yeah, I do. I think there's like lots of different layers to this. I think that in some ways that the level of distance we have from the medieval past allow people to be nostalgic in a way that perhaps they don't get tripped up as much by people fact checking. The number of people in the world who have a lot of specialist knowledge about the Middle Ages is still relatively limited, and our public kind of concept of what the Middle Ages is still very much shaped by the idea of knights and damsels, and it's a kind of fairly fertile open playground for people to project almost whatever they want onto it. It's a space for them to play, and sometimes that can be in really innocuous ways where people just are enjoying themselves creatively, but it can also be a place where you can put in any weird ideological thing that you want and you can find space for it. But I do think that also there are some elements of the Middle Ages, and I feel like this is something that medievalists have not been very good at getting to grips with. There are things about the Middle Ages that are just appealing to people who have reactionary ideas. And I'm someone who teaches and researches on things like gender and sex, and a lot of the time I want to be like, yay, the Middle Ages was so cool and quirky and fun, but also it was full of terrible things, as we know. And some of those things appeal to people who don't want a kind of a fair and balanced and egalitarian society. They like a bit of hierarchy, they like a bit of patriarchy, they're like, saddle up some more patriarchy ponies and let's all ride into battle on them, and that appeals to them. And I think there's also something about the very specific vision that people have, that the medieval world was almost like a closed world. It was this special safe sphere which wasn't really touched by people of color or anyone outside Western Europe, which is all nonsense, of course, but for them creates maybe a particularly safe space to project all kinds of fantasies of an Edenic world before the what they see as the poison of modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is true. It's kind of like this Disneyfication of medieval history in a way, where it's like, oh, medieval history is I don't know. I'm trying to think of one of the Disney movies that's medieval. Snow White. There you go. There you go. And it actually is just princesses frolicking. It's nothing but a bunch of princesses who frolic and then get saved by a knight, and ultimately, like, men are in control and everything kind of it ends up the way it needs to be, and you don't need to worry. There's not going to be I don't know, anything to trouble that or trouble you. I suppose that there's a kind of like desire for everything to work out. It's like a fairy tale-ness, right? Where it's kind of like, oh, there will be a happy ending. Like a knight on the with a sword is going to ride up. And sometimes you can denigrate the medieval period by being like, oh yeah, like, I don't know, bonkers myth about how people shit in the streets or something like that, right? And that kind of almost does the same thing, where you go, all right, well, we're going to keep the good bits about how we're all knights, but we're going to get rid of that, and so we're riding into this glorious future basically armed with Prince Charming, I guess. Like,
yeah, I think that, and it's something that I really grapple with, because I think those of us who are interested in communicating about the Middle Ages publicly, we want to connect our audience to the Middle Ages. We want to find places where there are sympathies, places of comparison and connection. That's a really natural instinct. But then it can result in a kind of flattening that actually makes drawing these connections between kind of like the the kind of the reactionary and fascist imaginary easier.
Mm.
One of the key things about the way the extreme right tend to imagine time is that it's cyclical, right? So
Mm.
if you look at the Nazis are a great example of this. They thought very much that kind of the French Revolution was the dawn of a terrible, age of corruption. It's kind of modernity, and the present moment
Mm.
that the Third Reich entered into was this awful time that was destined to kind of fall, and that both the past and the future is where glorious growth could happen. So in lots of ways, the past and the future for fascists tend to be really close together. It's almost like they feel like they can time travel. So one of the things that really fascinates me about nostalgia is that it's never ever just about looking backwards. It's always looking back with a view to bringing the past into the future. So you can almost like jump over this corrupt moment, and extremists are always thinking that whatever moment we're in, and it doesn't matter whether it's the 1930s or it's 2024, this is a moment that's on the verge of collapse. Society cannot be saved. It has to be reborn into a glorious kind of fascist future, and that's rebirth is really important. They don't want to create new things, and that's another place that really connects it, I think, with the medieval world, because medieval writers and thinkers, they're not that into the idea of innovation. Even when they were innovating, they were always presenting their ideas as old, as a kind of a rebirth, as rediscovery. That they want to always be looking back to a more glorious kind of past. And I think that's why, fascists really enjoy reading medieval writers. And I think, again, there's something interesting there. What I'm seeing a lot of in the work that I'm now doing, kind of researching kind of extremists on the internet, which, as you can imagine, is delightful.
Mm.
But they're actually engaging pretty deeply with medieval texts. They're not just all meatheads who post pictures of knights on horseback and say, "Oh, that's really great, I want a lance." Some of them are. I mean, there are definitely those guys, but there are guys who are reading, even things like the Decameron,
Mm.
and commenting on it, and they're seeing these as their people reaching out to them across time. And that's the scary thing for me, but also where there's a lot of interesting work to be done.
That's interesting because I feel like the Decameron is something that they would refer to as like degenerate, because it is so, well, I don't know, sexual and silly and like fun, but I guess maybe when you're doing it in the 14th century, that's fine, right? Like that's
I
that's
mean,
probably the where they're coming from.
I think you might get a different answer depending on if you talk to one of the you know high art and society and culture is bad reactionaries versus like the kind that you might have had back in the past who were at least outwardly seemed very had widely read and they understood a lot and they might be like, oh, the Decameron is part of our Western Western
Mm.
literary tradition of blah blah blah, and it talk and it's comes from a time when the Catholic Church was more paramount, and so people were pure and chaste, or more chaste and just, and like all like
Yeah, yeah.
I think I mean, I think what you guys are talking about, and coming as someone who is not studied in medieval history, I think people put it in like a snow globe because the Middle Ages just seems so weird. Everything about it
Mm.
seems weird to us. Like the weird fuzzy borders, how everything overlaps, how like knights and chivalry and feudalism and bastard, whatever, it all just seems so weird, and it just seems like a snow globe that you can go back and look at and you're like, oh, it's it's like King Arthur, and you can just kind of apply that anywhere, and you forget that those are just a bunch of stories that have been processed through various narratives over time, and and it's like I think that people do that, and so when they do that, they can pick and choose the ideas from the Middle Ages that appeal to them now, such as, oh, there weren't any black people, which, whether it's true or not doesn't matter, because that is the idea that they have of the snow
Mm.
globe, and they're like, oh, and everybody was more was more pure of heart, and they worship Christ, even though like this person might be a modern day like evangelical, and they're thinking about a time when the Catholic Church would have stomped out any type of evangelicalism at
Yeah.
a moment's notice. It's just like people throw everything into that snow globe and shake it up, and they're like, oh, that was the medieval era in my head. Yeah, yeah, that's what it seems like to me anyway.
Okay, well, you just hit on something here, Luke, that I wanted to ask Rachel about too, which is so we're talking about nostalgia in terms of the modern looking at the medieval and saying, "Oh, I want to be like that again." But you hit on this also, Rachel, but medieval people do this, right? Like what is Arthuriana if not a form of nostalgia, right? And this idea that we've got to return to a Christian king, and also that he's going to come from under a mountain and save us all at some point in time. Most knowledge at the time is perceived as, having degraded since we were
Yep.
in
Mhm.
the Garden of Eden. And so actually to be smarter, you have to study the classics, for example, in order to learn anything. You're not attempting to reinvent the wheel. You're trying to take this knowledge that was there and build on it. What is the Holy Roman Empire if not a form of nostalgia for the Roman Empire? But we're doing it right this time, gang, right?
Mhm.
We see this all the time, right, in the medieval era as well. So I guess to a certain extent, it makes sense that this is what people go for.
Yeah, I think, and I think King Arthur is a great example because that's just a hotbed of nostalgia kind of from the start and to the present day. I mean, if you've seen kind of the Netflix classic about the time traveling knight, what's that called? A Night Before Christmas or
Oh
something.
God, yes, the night before Christmas.
But there's some
Oh.
really there's some weird stuff about nostalgia for chivalry in there, and I talk to my students about it, and it's great. But if I was thinking about Thomas Mallory, so Mallory, who writes one of the great English works, which is known as the Morte d'Arthur now, and he's writing that during the Wars of the Roses, and this is a time when people were feeling like their society was potentially collapsing,
Mm.
and he writes this great work which is based on clearly reading tons and tons of French romances, and he strips out all the naughty bits and he focuses on what he thinks are the important values of the Arthurian legend. And there's a bit at the end where he says, some men say, in many parts of England, that King Arthur is not dead, but has, by the will of our Lord Jesu, into another place, and he will come again, and he will win the Holy Cross. And he's already, expressing that kind of nostalgic desire for a return, even though he spent thousands of pages showing the ways in which the Arthurian court was essentially doomed. But he wants it back because it's better than the present moment that he's living through. And that to me is really interesting, that there's nostalgia as a kind of escapism, but maybe nostalgia also as a way of controlling
Mm.
your kind of present political moment by trying to reassert some kind of authority that maybe you think that you've lost. And Mallory probably wrote some of this when he was imprisoned, one of several times, and on charges of rape and all kinds of other horrible things. One of the fathers of chivalry there doing
Mm.
very unchivalrous things. And that for me, there's something about the kernel of nostalgia which is contradictory.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
You want to go to a place that has never really existed. It's something like utopia. That the term utopia, it comes from utopos, a place that is not.
Mm.
Mhm.
And nostalgia is like that. You want to go somewhere that's never existed and you
Mm.
want to make it happen again. You kind of want to travel through time, but to a place that you've invented. And that's like the biggest form, I suppose, of control that you can have. If you can imagine a past into being, then you're kind of the architect of your own future. And I think that's why a lot of people who, for various reasons, fairly and unfairly, feel disenfranchised by the present moment are really attracted to nostalgic visions of the past. But that was just as true, I think, in the Middle Ages as it is today.
Damn, we really are not so different. Bam, said the line.
That's it. We're
Like,
done.
we did that's
No, I
well,
think
okay. Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
I was just gonna say I think you're absolutely right because when we did I'll just keep it real short. When we did the Inferno, like they're like Dante is just like waxing poetic about the Roman Empire and how Caesar is great and like he has some of these people in the virtuous pagans, and he even puts like Trajan into purgatory and stuff. Like he has this like ideal of the Roman Empire. And okay, like I mean, I get that because it was, this big homogenous thing, but it also killed your Lord and Savior. Like I get that they have like a special way of like kind of delineating and being like, well, it wasn't really the same one. Like, man, if the Roman Empire is the vessel which God has put on the earth to lead his people, and then it can't also kill it's fine. But what I'm saying is those contradictions and nostalgia, I think, have existed for a very long time because he literally is just like, man, it was so great under Caesar. Sure, I mean he would have killed Jesus too, but it's fine. It's fine. It was so great. I love it so yeah, like
Well,
yeah.
you see that
Anyway.
all the time too with Italians, like especially in the 14th century, like the tribunate that takes over Rome at a point in time, of whom like Cola di Rienzo is one. They're constantly writing fanfic
Hmm.
about how great Rome is. A Petrarch, that's his whole shebang. He's
Hmm.
like, yeah, and then Rome should rule everything again. And that one is an interesting one. Okay, so because I got to skip to this bit now, okay? Because right. I would argue, for example, that the Renaissance is absolutely nothing but nostalgia getting really, really out of control, right? Because everyone suddenly just gets really nostalgic for Roman architecture, and then they start making things, in this fashion. And of course, we've done that with medieval architecture already, right? In the 19th century, we do this. And you get all the cool neo-Gothic stuff, which I'm a fan of. I like
Hmm.
when Victorians while out and make a Gothic church, quote unquote. Now, granted, I think that there's some kind of troubling romantic nostalgia behind that. They are all saying we've got to return to the Middle Ages because we don't like factories, things of this
Yeah.
nature. But there is something kind of in there. So I mean, I guess that my question is, if we're talking about nostalgia, are there places like art and architecture, for example, where maybe it's not so bad? I mean, I say that, and then I'm like, immediately there were terrible knock-on effects from the Renaissance, like, oh, I don't know, like all the 30 Years' War, I would argue is a direct result of the Renaissance because Pope wanted a new Vatican or whatever. But like, can we just enjoy pretty things, I guess? Or is it always going to be laced with ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I think, all our faves are problematic, right? And,
Mm.
hot take on the Renaissance, how much of our culture is built on the edifice of basically the cognitive dissonance of white men fantasizing about regimes that would have eaten them for breakfast?
Yeah,
Right,
true.
and so there is something really, there's a kind of unstable foundation for basically a lot of our culture, and I do think it comes back to that. Basically, great guys like Dante fanficking about people who you probably would have, had them executed for one thing or another,
Hmm.
Mm.
and not ever reckoning with that dissonance. And I think that's something that we have to do as academics. You can enjoy all these beautiful places and things, but you kind of have to take a step back and say, well, but there are consequences of
Mm.
these beauties and pleasures. They don't emerge in a vacuum. Nothing is without a context, and this is the kind of thing that stops people inviting you to parties. But I do think it's important to say, and I think that this kind of cognitive dissonance that we see with nostalgia is one of the reasons, for instance, that Trump voters are so able to just keep absorbing all the kind of insane and contradictory things that come out of the kind of the Trumpian movement. Research has shown that Trump supporters will support Trump's interests and positions regardless of what they are, and that they really are demonstrating a lot of kind of cultic tendencies in
Mm-hmm.
their intellectual and emotional responses. And in some ways, I think that we can see that in the way people have a kind of nostalgic approach to the past, that they will change the narrative to fit their vision, that just educating people about the kind of the true facts of the past isn't enough. You can't just say, well, X and Y didn't happen in the Middle Ages. That's not what people are interested in. You have to get into much more fundamental things and figure out what is it about this vision of the past that's really appealing to these people, and how do we dismantle that? But that's a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so which this leads me to like yet another one of my questions here. It's like, when you see people being quite nostalgic for the Middle Ages, obviously there is a critique of the present that's going on, right? So there's that quite pervasive medieval peasants had more time off than you do thing, where I'm always like, well, I mean, technically, but you get that they don't work an office job, right? It's like, the cow still needs milking. You still have to, make bread every morning, all of these things. And so I guess is this, what do we say this is a function on, right? It's like where we are in our society. Is this just happening as a result of people's total alienation from labor, or like is this about the fact that neoliberalism has kind of got us to this point where like the treats aren't coming anymore, and everyone's like, hey, wait a minute, I was promised that there was going to be cheap TVs at the very least if I was going to put up with all, is it, or is it, a much more complex thing? What would we say about that?
Yeah, I think that some of it is about people finding ways to find kind of collective identities. So they're expressing dissatisfaction with their present circumstances. And that can help bond people together. But one of the really interesting things that I've discovered in my research on kind of radicalization, how people are radicalized into extreme right movements, is that negative emotions aren't enough to bond people together. So we talk about hate groups, and they are hate groups, but people don't stay in movements just because they're bonded by hate and fear. They have to have positive emotions to form collectives. And nostalgia, it seems like, is often really a core function of those groups. So people can share this nostalgic vision of the past that they all are buying into. And it doesn't matter if it's accurate or not, as long as they all share the same kind of ideas about the past. And that really helps them cement a kind of community identity together. And it also means that when people maybe like us start critiquing them and saying, hey, that's not really what the Middle Ages were like, that then they can cast us as the kind of the evil external forces who are attacking their collective vision of the past and a glorious future they could have. And that helps cement their kind of core identities together.
That's a really interesting point, because obviously, we're seeing a lot of this in the States, right? Where there's like, where people are just straight up coming out and saying, stop teaching history. Like, I don't want you to do that because it's troubling my nostalgia. Like, I mean, we saw this, I think it kind of all began with like AP US history, where they were like, stop saying that enslaved people were sad. And it's just like, what are you? And it's so explicit, right? But of course, I think this is an important point, right? That it's not just bad things that bond people together, because that's actually one of the things that I think, anyone to the left or the right, this includes centrists, sometimes don't really get about nostalgia as a kind of cohesive thing. Because, for example, what happened here with Brexit, where everyone was like, oh yeah, well, we told you it would get worse. We told you over and over and over that things would get worse if we left the EU, and you didn't believe us. And now look what's happened. And it's like, well, yeah, but what they had was a positive story. Now, it was bonkers and stupid,
Yeah.
right? But they were able to say, remember when the bin man was hard? It's like, remember like when, the milkman came, like, we're gonna do all of this again. We're unleashing the potential of Britain, right? And there was no counterpoint to that for Remain.
Yeah.
It was like, well, things, because it wasn't like, oh, things will get better. It was like, no, this is as good as it gets, guys.
Yeah.
And I'm threatening you with worse. And it's not a rallying cry, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that made me crazy, Joe. But so I said, why aren't you saying, look at this Cornish community that was radically enriched by EU
Hmm.
funds? But no, there was none of that. And I think the nostalgia is important for the left. And I was thinking about your kind of comment about the fantasies about a pre-industrial time, but that appealed to the left in the past. I went to a really interesting exhibition on Ruskin in Sheffield recently, and thinking about, I mean, Ruskin, crazy guy, but
Oh yeah, bonkers.
really interested in enriching workers' lives. And a lot of that was about this kind of weird medievalism, kind of let's return to handicrafts. But he had a lot of good points about actually, let people create things, let people be enriched by traditional crafts. And, a lot of his comments about kind of machine-led work were, accurate. It's just that it can really easily get tied up with a lot of discourse that is reactionary as well. But maybe the left needs to lean in a little bit more to, well, what is it that people find appealing about the past and run with it? That doesn't mean entering into a kind of dangerous fantasy space, but saying it's okay to want to play in the past. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. You can enjoy the weird pleasures of medieval history, of which there are very many, super weird and super fun things. And that I think sometimes we, shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit by, as you say, not having a positive story to sell people, and that we let the right and the far right have all the rallying cries because we think that they're being too simplistic, as well as obviously, politically wrong in lots of ways.
Yeah.
But maybe, part of taking control of the narrative of history should be letting ourselves enjoy stories a little bit more.
Oh, let
Some
people enjoy things. Yeah.
I know,
something I
crazy.
something I do like I do have a particular nostalgia for the Middle Ages in like very limited respects. Like the communal aspects of
Mm,
anything that get brought up, even if it's in the worst societies of people who would have fucking hated my guts and
yeah.
everything that I think. Like the idea that like you had like a literal community of people, like, uh, that you could rely on, like if something something happens and, your house burns down, people could, come together and
Mm,
help you rebuild or something, like you can leave your kids with someone instead of having to drop them and pay for like a daycare and stuff like that. And it's like, I think that is good. I think
mm,
that is right. And I also think like I have nostalgia for the fact that like people weren't alienated from their work to the
mm,
point we are now. Back then, like obviously it was different and it was mystified and the whole thing, but like to be able to like work with your hands and do stuff like that is something that people like want to do because like they have lives where they have fake email jobs, or even if they have a real like, or even if not a real job, sorry, even if they have like a job where they like work with their hands a lot, like you still have to deal with so much bullshit. And it's not just like something where you can like fix up a house and then, go do something else and you see the benefit of your labor out in the world. But like, so you get people and they're like, well, yeah, I want to go, like, oh, I have this vision of like wanting to be like a yeoman farmer. None of us know how the fuck to farm now, but it's also like in the mind that seems so much more plausible and achievable than like anything else because like it's just completely cut off. You don't even have that option anymore. Like, and it's just like there was good stuff back then. We just have to bring the good stuff back, the good aspects forward. And Rachel, I think you're absolutely right. We do have to be more positive about that stuff and like what does this mean for like people and like why is communism or collectivism or whatever you want to call it, why is that a good thing?
mm.
And what would that do? And you'd be like, look, we can have communities again. We may not all be yeoman farmers anymore because because the world has progressed so far back beyond that, but we can, you know, take ownership of the means of production and then, you know,
like,
Get less alienation that way.
a
Yeah.
common green, right? Like, so
Yes, yes,
I
yes.
live in the part of London where like stuff that Ruskin did directly makes my life better. Like, I can go to one of the parks that's established. Like, I'm right around like where I don't know, his family like owned everything where I live,
Mm.
which is like, but there's a really banging park that's got like this cool old pergola with like three kinds of wisteria on it, and I go and enjoy it, and I'm like, John Ruskin, he was afraid of pubes, like whatever. But like there are things that he did, and this is something that I am quite interested in, is this these ideas of benevolence, and that's something I guess I'm slightly nostalgic for, in a more limited capacity from, the standpoint of I guess the Industrial Revolution. But when industrialists would be like, yeah, but you gotta make a school for the people, or like when at least in the medieval period you could kind of guilt the king into doing good things sometimes, question mark, like, the fear of Christianity that there used to be, where, supposed Christians would be like, oh yeah, I'm probably going to hell because of all this money, huh? I should probably do something. Whereas now, like with the prosperity gospel and everything, that stuff's just totally out the window.
Yeah.
So I could be nostalgic for those things from a leftist perspective, where I'm like, I'm nostalgic for shaming rich people. Uh, is that I'm nostalgic for the public green, and I'm nostalgic for communal links and that sort of thing. And of course I'm also nostalgic for strong trade unionism, things like that,
Yeah, but I mean,
but
there's so much there, isn't. I think community is key. We live in a society that's increasingly atomized, even with our online spaces, and people long for community. And one
Mm.
thing that the right wing and the extreme right wing are really good at is providing spaces for people. And they are very good at finding people who feel alienated, people who feel like they don't have a place in society. And they can gradually radicalize them. And, nobody becomes a kind of a far right kind of radical extremist straight away. It's a process. It's not a discrete event. And so something that I'm tracking at the moment is the way in which, online accounts that are selling these kind of visions of the Middle Ages of, a time when men were men, and you can look to the Middle Ages for fitness advice. I mean, this is genuinely a thing that they have. They're really into Henry Cavill, and they're really into looking like knights, and they kind of combine them in their mind. And so they think, you can become fit, you can become a man. And that gradually leads them on to, you can defend your women folk with arms, and then you can defend them against Muslims. And then, you're learning about how to make pipe bombs, but it can be a long, long process. And by the time people are there, they're really deeply embedded into a community that they feel, perhaps for the first time in their lives, supports them and understands them. And that is not me justifying their behavior, but we have to understand the emotional pull of these movements. But I think it's really interesting what you say about, the longing for, maybe there's a kind of authority that people find attractive about the past, because, I was thinking about super rich people in the past compared to the present. I mean, Elon Musk, unless you have very niche tastes, is nobody's like kind of fantasy daddy. But maybe there are people who in the past, they're looking at medieval lords and they imagine that they are benevolent. They have this idea of lordship and chivalry that makes them think, these guys might give us orders, but they would also look after us. And gosh, wouldn't that actually be restful compared to all the kind of junk I have to deal with in my regular life? I'd kind of like to return to a time where a strong, well-meaning man told me what to do. That's not my personal taste, but I can see why people find that appealing, and it could be quite seductive. And I think a lot of this is coming down to a dissatisfaction that people have with the present moment, some of which may just be, based on racism and homophobia and sexism, but some of it I think is things that people should be genuinely concerned about, the ways in which our communities are being eroded, our access to free time and creativity and spaces to find solidarity have been taken away from us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I'm quite obsessed with this like longing that people have for the medieval, when it's like, but I mean, granted, we don't live in democracies, we live in complex republics, blah, 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 blah. But, you are longing for a time when you don't have a say in things. And I do think part of that longing is kind of wanting a daddy like, a nice daddy who loves me, who's going to come along and take care of it. Like, no one imagines Pedro the Cruel is going to be like their lord, right? It's like that,
Yeah.
oh,
Mhm.
that's an anomaly. It's always going to be King Arthur, right? But I also wonder, like, how much do you think there's also something going on there where they believe that they are that because they believe they're the knight, right?
Yeah,
Like
of
they believe that
course.
they're Henry Cavill. And so they believe that they are going to be the guy who says that, like,
Hmm.
despite all evidence to the contrary, like it's like you're some guy in, I don't know, Boise. I don't know what that's not going to happen for you.
Well, it's like people who, claim that they've been able to, hypnotherapy their way into seeing their past lives. And, everyone is Nefertiti. No one is just, handmaiden number five.
No. Yeah.
People always imagine that they will be the lead actors in this story. So it's not a bad thing to imagine yourself as the knight to a wonderful lord, and you will serve him, but he will respect you. I mean, I don't think that any of these people, despite all the things they post about how farming is great, actually imagine that they would be the peasant farmers. They're seeing themselves as, the knights who ride in and take the profits of the peasant class, basically.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, even when you see people who are like the trying to do the trad wife thing, where they're like, "Oh, here I am, and I told my husband I'm gonna homeschool the kids, and we're gonna have a cow," and it's like, yeah, cute, but like, you still have piped in water. I know you're not a subsistence farmer. I know that you are not growing literally everything that you eat. You're like you doing this stuff to augment what it is that you have. I know that you're not going to give up chocolate, right? Like these are not going to be things that take away from your life. It's all this kind of, it's very Marie Antoinette, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
Mm.
it is again that nostalgia. Like, I mean, and granted, Marie Antoinette doesn't, wasn't looking to the past, but she's looking for in an idyll, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
She dyed her sheep, and the trad wives are posting lovely kind of soft focus photos of themselves and their children, making pickles, but producing 10 kilner jars of kind of pickled cabbage is not going to make you a subsistence farmer, and they're not really interested in that. They're interested, I think, in the authority actually that manifesting these trappings gives to the audience that they're targeting, because they're very rarely just doing this for themselves. They're doing this for an audience who's kind of lapping up the kind of ideal lifestyle that they're putting out there into the world.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's like, check this out, everybody. Like, I like pickles. You know, I make sourdough. Like, I get it. I feel all of these things, right? But and sure, I would like more hours in the day to do those things, and I agree with it. But come on. Like, although I also my a friend Sarah and I are obsessed with watching kind of like weird trad wives who are doing like bonkers things. Like there's this one woman in Alaska that we're obsessed with because she's going to give herself botulism at any moment. She's like, for some reason, buying like sacks and sacks of potatoes and then canning them, question mark. I'm like, girl, dig a root cellar. I don't know what to tell you. And she's like canning them with the skin on. And she's like, people tell you not to do this. But and I'm like, you are going to get botulism. You're going, oh my God. Like, and it's just like it's stuff like that. But anyway, I love it. I'm obsessed with it.
And it's
It's
fascinating, is it? Because, if we're thinking back to kind of the medieval peasant woman, how much joy would she have had in escaping having to do all these tasks? She'd be like, I can buy potatoes,
oh my
kind
God.
of
Like
crazy.
yeah, I made the mistake once of reading a review, which I'll never do again. I learned, but like I made this show last year about the working lives of medieval women, and one of the things I was kind of talking about is like the general exploitation of women as just like free labor that you could do with whatever. And I started off the whole thing by talking about a letter on virginity, which granted is like it's a letter that's basically trying to convince women not to get married and to like, stay pure instead. But one of the things they talk about is being like, it sucks being a wife. It fucking sucks. And they're like, you're gonna come in from the fields, you're gonna be exhausted, and the baby's crying, and you got to cook dinner, and your husband's just sitting there doing fucking nothing, and it's awful. And this guy in the replies was like, I think this is a really modern way of looking at things, and you're putting modern ideas about exploitation onto it, and actually the women were fine. And I'm like, bro,
Yeah.
I am quoting a source
Yeah, I get
from
this with
medieval women, right?
undergraduates, you
Like,
know, that they're shocked when we look at sources where people are saying things like this, and they're like, oh, this seems like a really modern perspective. And I think no, that, you know, maybe we just have a medieval perspective. You know, we haven't moved on from there. Kind of
people
thing,
people
you know?
didn't just develop an awareness of oppression in like 1840 or whatever the fuck. It, yeah,
I
that's, I
don't
mean,
like
it's ridiculous. Like people didn't like slaves in the past didn't know that slavery was bad, or that, I mean,
I
people who
know,
weren't
right?
slaves didn't also write, abolitionist things, thousands of years ago. It's like, like people knew this stuff was bad. People, the slaves knew it was bad. The people who enslaved them knew it was bad because they didn't want to be enslaved themselves. It's like,
Yeah,
come on
exactly.
now.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? Like,
Ugh.
but
Well,
it fits the thing better if the woman is like, no, I love picking the fields and coming in and seeing my husband doing jack shit. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
that's fun for me. I love it. Love that. But
Hmm.
yeah, like, ugh. Well, okay. Gosh, I think we kind of have to leave it there. But I guess I'm gonna like leave us on, a positive note. So we've noted some places and things that people on the left can be, nostalgic about, things that we're nostalgic about. Do you think that there is a place for it for us? Is there anything that we can like learn as people who are genuinely kind of trying to not let the fascists take over, I guess?
Yeah, and I think that it's coming back to what both of you have said about thinking about the things in the past that are of value to us. And I think a lot of that, you know, this is very granola crunchy, but it comes down to community and the connections that we're building with one another. And maybe we're not going to be doing it in a farm collective. And I have to tell you, you know, I would not look good in a straw bonnet out in the fields. I'm happy to carry on doing the job that I'm doing, but you know, things like the moments that we're creating here, that's, you know, that's a form of community. The kind of reaching out to one another in our kind of the places where we live, you know, we can form local communities. And that's maybe harnessing nostalgia in a positive way that allows us to push back against these big tidal forces that want to tell us that our, you know, obliteration is inevitable, because that's what fascists say. That's how they disempower us. They say that, you know, inevitably you're going to collapse and our vision of the past is going to become your future. But I refuse to accept that. But we can only, I think, really resist it if we are forming communities who also want to push back against that story.
That's a really great place to leave it, Rachel. Thank you for being an ideal podcast guest and
Thank you so much.
making time for us today. Where can the good people of We're Not So Different World engage with you, find more about your work?
So I have a personal website, which is rachelemoss.com. I am on Blue Sky. I do have a Twitter account, but I'm not using that so much anymore because, you know, Elon Musk. So you can search for me there. And my university profile, Rachel Moss at the University of Northampton, UK, will bring me up. I welcome emails from your guests. And I'm sure that somebody at least will want to say there were no potatoes in the Middle Ages. So
Look,
we
we
can address
know,
that
all right?
another time.
Okay, you're right, but also medieval people would have been so excited about a potato,
So excited about
right?
potatoes.
Come on, right?
Thank you.
If someone emails you about potatoes, please let us know, because I will yell at everyone. Like, come on, people.
Guys, don't embarrass
Let's.
us in front of Rachel, okay? Come
Oh man,
on.
come on, don't come on,
Uh,
oh, they didn't have tomatoes. Yeah, man, it's just a figure of speech. Just insert something they did have.
Sorghum.
Sheep. They had to come in from shearing the sheep. Yeah, there you go. Like, come on. Yeah. Yeah. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. This is great. And thank you for letting us know where to find you. Eleanor, where can everyone find you? Find your
Yeah,
stuff.
I'm on the socials at Going Medieval. I'm more on Blue Sky these days. It's true. I'm like Rachel. I don't know, man. The vibe is just, I don't know, the people were always yelling at me and I was tired. I don't know. Yeah, of course, my book, The Once and Future Sex, is now out in paperback in the US. It will be out in paperback in the UK next month. I'm taking it personally. If you haven't bought it yet, I'll come and find you.
Hmm.
And otherwise, you can always check out the blog at going-medieval.com.
Yeah, and you can find me at the usual places. Luke is amazing on most of the socials. I'm more on Twitter because, I don't know.
Someone's got to fight the good
I'm
fight,
one of the
Nate.
weird people who has a relatively nice time there. You know,
You're
but
like those tardigrades, right? The little guys who like live
yeah,
in
yeah.
you're living in the volcanic vent, just like chilling. It's like you and
Those
those
guys are so
crabs.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Volcanic vents, they survived in the vacuum of space. Yeah. Oh,
That's
great. We're
you.
gonna get me talking about something else. Yeah. And you can find my old show, People's History of the Old Republic. It's about Star Wars if you want to listen to me wax nostalgic about video games I played when I was comics I read when I was 10 and video games I played when I was in college. Yep. Anyway, yeah. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.